So I'm going to give you a... I want to go through the questions now. Are we going to save these? Kevin, you put them back on that last slide. Okay, so we'll save our general questions we want to pose to you. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of Portico and what we do, and again, some of the challenges we're facing, and help us decide how to move forward. So Portico's overall mission is to offer the scholarly community, everyone, libraries, publishers, the individual authors who write the content, the ability to support preservation through separate services that we've broken in the past so far into e-journal, e-book, and what we call D-collections, which are digitized collections of, large collections of reference books, so things like collections of primary sources, publishers, those are the things. In the services we've offered, and as you'll hear, one of the things I want to talk about is what, or do those categories of content and publication, and or are there new kinds of collections of content that we need to be thinking about? Model for Portico is a two-sided one. It's interesting. Financial support comes equally from the library community and the publisher community. Sorry, is that better? From the library and the publishing community together. So libraries pay a fee to Portico to be participants, which means that they benefit from all of Portico's services, which I'll talk about more in a second. And publishers pay to have their content ingested and kept in the Portico dark archive. The only situations in which content is lit up or made available is what we call a trigger event. And this happens when a publisher goes out of business, when it decides to no longer publish a journal or a series of books or a D collection, or when there's a long-term technical catastrophe such that access to the content is no longer available to users, to libraries and their users. So trigger events are when things are made available to participants. In the past, it's been to the Portico participants. Going forward, and this is another thing I want to talk about today, we're going to be, and we've already started on a small scale, giving the option for publishers to have us trigger things open access. So if it's an open access publisher and they wish to have things triggered to everyone on an OA model, we are going to be able to do that now. Just to be clear, we already have a number of open access collections within Portico. Many of our publishers have both open access and subscription-based materials. We're now starting to see, as you know, many more exclusively open access publishers who are looking for preservation solutions. And so this raises interesting questions, which we will get to later, both in terms of how do we reach these publishers, what kinds of OA publishers should be in Portico, and what does it mean to guarantee that in perpetuity you're going to make content available on an open access basis. I thought it would be useful just to review what we consider the key goals of digital preservation so that this will provide the basis for our conversation. We use these 4 bullets. Usability, the requirement, meaning that the intellectual content of the item must remain usable via the delivery mechanism of current technology. And so what that means is that we have to migrate the content as technology changes, so that if PDF, for example, disappeared in 20 years, we would have moved the content into a technology that would be usable by libraries and their users. Authenticity, meaning that the provenance of the content must be proven and that we know that the content is an authentic replica of the original. Third is discoverability. The content must have logical and consistent bibliographic metadata so that it can be found by end users through time, again, over the long term. And accessibility. The content must be available for use by the community over the long term. And so it has to be made available in formats and on platforms that are usable and accessible by the people who need to get it. To give you a quick overview of Portico, facts and figures. It's a very big operation. We work with now actually 245 participating publishers. You have a little bit more than this now, about 920 participating libraries in the U.S. and abroad. We have over 31 million articles. The ebook service, I should have said, is newer than the journals. It's only a couple years old, and and it's actually the fastest growing piece of the of Portico. We've got 172,000 ebooks now, and we have 10 triggered journal titles. So that might not seem like a lot, but over the 8 or so years that Portico's been around, 10 of our journals have disappeared and would not be available were it not that they were in Portico and we've triggered them. So this is just to give you a sense of how much content there is, how many moving parts there are in Portico. Now, we've thought a lot about what it means to be a trusted preservation archive. And I've tried to put together some things that I think are important to keep in mind as we talk about what it means to preserve. First of all, you have to have preservation as a mission. As you know, there are many kinds of organizations disseminating content, helping authors write content, helping shape and produce content. Preservation is a special piece of that range of activities, and having that as at least a major piece of your mission, if not your only mission, is really critical when we talk about trustworthiness and digital preservation. Second, transparency regarding your process. It needs to be clear to the community what you mean by preservation, what you're doing, and to actually let the community in and see where the content is. So we have a function that allows users to audit, we call it audit our archive, and on the site you can log in and you can see on this dashboard we've built where content is. If you're a library, you can see where everything in your collection and in other collections is in the process of preservation. If you're a publisher, you can see where your content is. How much is in, how much is delivered, how much is waiting to be archived. So being very transparent about what you're doing, I think, is an important thing to think about when you're talking about preservation. You need to show that you have reliable delivery of your service over time. So if a journal disappears, you need to have a process in place so that you can relatively quickly make sure that you do what you need to do to make sure that the content is triggered and is made available. Our goal is uninterrupted access for users. Anything that's in the archive, even if it's no longer available from the publisher. So this effective response to a trigger event over time is important. Willingness to be audited and let people, as I said, look at where things are and make those data that they find public. The ability to collaborate with others. This is something I think we need to do a lot more of in, well, I think both in the publishing, but especially in the preservation space. We need to work with each other to make sure that we're not reproducing work more than we need to be doing it, and that we're figuring out who's best at what piece of this huge, huge challenge of preserving content together as partners. And then I'll talk a little bit more about this in my next slide, the capacity to handle what I see as a big wave of future preservation challenges heading our way. So what are these challenges? So I think the new forms of scholarly content that a number I have referred to today, there are all sorts of new things coming along. There is content that's not in a linear format, that's really not a journal, a monograph that we're used to seeing. Based around audio-visual materials. There's content where what we would have called primary sources is actually making the argument that the author is trying to present. These are all coming now and will be much more so in the future, and we need to understand what it means to preserve this kind of content. Executable software, which is increasingly becoming part of a lot of science journals and soon other areas as well. Second, the exponential growth of data that's in need of preservation. This is a huge issue. Figshare is taking on a big chunk of it. There are others who are starting to deal with this. We've actually, in partnership with the Johns Hopkins Data Curation Center, Portico, and they have received a grant, Own Foundation. Our other partners, IEEE, publishers, we just found out about this last month. We're going to be developing a tool that preserves the link between the published article that's in a preservation service and the places with many different pieces. So connecting data to the articles or books or other forms of scholarly content and making sure that that connection is stable, I think, is going to be a very big challenge going forward. As I said, collaboration to leverage rather than reproduce expertise in this area, partnerships and collaborations. Finally, the subject of our meeting, including OA publishers and preservation services. Challenges around that, and as I said, we're going to present some specific questions to you at the end that we need help on. But just to name a couple of issues that I have on my mind, how do we figure out how to reach some of the very small, the long tail of small publishers, many of which are OA publishers? How do we bring them in? How do we figure out business models? Because it doesn't cost, unfortunately, it does not cost less to preserve content that's open access. It's the same process that we have to go through to preserve it in a responsible way. But as you know, there are different business models associated with those publications. Figure out how we're going to support the preservation of that content. And do we need to think about limiting the kinds of OA publishers that we accept into Portico? It's a big responsibility to say you're going to commit to making something OA in a trigger event forever. And we need to think about whether we're working with responsible publishers with responsible. So those are just a bunch of big challenges I'm throwing out at you. We'll talk about them more in the discussion. That's my summary, and I think now Kevin's going to talk about his work. Thank you.